Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some die-cut Christmas card making using the new Simon Hurley North Pole Friends collection from Spellbinders. So we have an adorable Polar Bear Pals die set, the North Pole Sentiments die set with a nice snowman die and accessories on there, and then the adorable Santa's Elves die set with a few things that they can hold, as well as a couple options for their poses. And then last but certainly not least, we have the Clauses die set. So you can make Mr. or Santa and Mrs. Claus with this set. I'm only going to do Santa for this one, but you can easily do Mrs. Claus with him as well. So for my color inspiration, I am using one of the cards from the new DIY deck holiday expansion. So it's got a pretty Christmas image there, and I've chosen colors that go with that image. I have a few extra colors that I'm also using, but that holiday expansion set has 12 different images in there, so there's some great inspiration for holiday color palettes. So for my first card, I'm using the Polar Bear Pals die set. And anytime I do die cutting with animals, I always love to use velvet cardstock just to give it a little bit of extra texture. So the velvet cardstock that I have is actually adhesive velvet cardstock. So to make it a little bit easier for assembly, I put it on some scrap cardstock before die cutting it. It die cuts just like regular cardstock, so there's no issues at all with die cutting it, or you don't need to do anything special with it. When you glue it together, and I always, for most things, use Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, you do need to give it a little bit of extra time to dry. And because it's velvet cardstock, that glue wants to just absorb into that velvet. So I typically will put the glue on the area right before I put the piece that I want to glue on top of it, so that it has a chance to adhere to that piece before starting to absorb into the velvet. But like I said, you do want to give it a little bit of extra time to dry. I'm also using several different cardstocks from the different treasured cardstock packs. So I'm going to be using gold, I'm using onyx, I'm using silver, as well as the antique white. I'm using the glitter paper, or the glitter piece in the antique white. And anytime you use glitter paper or like metallic paper, paper with coating, you need to give a little bit of extra time for that to dry as well. And that's mainly because there's a coating on top of those papers, so it doesn't really absorb, or the glue doesn't really absorb into the paper. You need to give that glue a little bit of time to set because it takes a little bit longer. So anytime I'm doing die cutting or doing cards with die cutting, especially ones like this where there's a lot of die cutting, when I first figure out what I want to do, I sort all of my dies into the different cardstocks that I want to die cut with them. It makes it a little bit easier. It can be overwhelming when you have die sets that have a lot of pieces to them. It can make it a little bit overwhelming to figure out exactly what you want to do with what. And because there's a lot of pieces, it just is overwhelming because there's a lot of pieces. But by dividing the different dies into the different colors or the different cardstocks that you want to do, and then just doing your die cutting once you've got all of that organized, it makes it a lot easier. I also use craft stacks, and I show them a lot in my videos. So when I'm doing my die cutting, as I'm die cutting everything, I put it into those craft stacks to make sure that all of my pieces are all in one spot. They have lids on them that stay on them really, really securely. So if by chance I happen to drop the container, I tend to be a klutz, I'm not going to lose all those pieces. They're not going to scatter all over the place if I have that lid on, because the lids are on nice and securely. So when I'm gluing these pieces together, you can see from all of the cards when I'm doing that, I'm kind of jumping around in assembling my pieces, especially when I'm using some specialty cardstocks that take a little bit of extra time to dry. While those pieces are drying, I'm working on other pieces so that I'm not just standing there watching glue dry. I tend to not be the most patient person when it comes to crafting. There's some things that I have a lot of patience for, but watching glue dry is not really one of them. So not only do you have to wait a little bit longer with specialty papers, but I also have a large acrylic block that I put my pieces under so that everything has some good contact while it's drying. And when it comes to the little teeny tiny pieces with the faces, I'll often use a jewel picker to put them in place, and then my die pick just to move them around to get perfect placement with them. When I'm using the jewel picker, I can kind of control exactly how it lands or how my piece goes, but sometimes it needs to be adjusted a little bit, and I find the die pick works really, really well for that. So I do the base of these polar bears and then I add the little sweaters and hats. And I love the fact that there are sweaters and hats for them. They make it just so festive for the holidays and for winter. This set here has the adult bear sitting like the one that I'm creating, but there's also one that you see a side profile from. So there's a couple choices with that, which gives you a little bit more options when you're creating. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm using velvet cardstock for my polar bears here for the base. You could also use velvet cardstock for the hat as well as the scarf to give that a little bit of extra texture. I just have them done or die cut with some regular cranberry cardstock, but you could use velvet for that as well. Just like you could also use regular cardstock for the bears themselves. You don't have to use the velvet cardstock. I love the extra texture it gives, but it's not 100% necessary. If you want to do it with just plain white cardstock, that will absolutely work and it will look fantastic. So I push the bear die cuts off to the side so that they can dry a little bit while I work on the background. I'm using the Sparkling Snow embossing folder. And not only do I want to emboss my background, but I want to ink it as well. So anytime I'm inking while I'm embossing, I always use some Best Ever Craft tape to tape my cardstock in place so that I don't have to worry about it moving. I also make sure to tape it so that when I do my inking, I'm inking the background. I'm not inking the snowflakes in this case. I'm using some tumbled glass distress ink. You do need to do this multiple times. The first time you do it, you're never going to get full coverage and the ink will build up, and you can do it as many or as few times as you want. Typically for me, the happy spot or the happy amount is about 3 times. Sometimes I might need to do it a little bit extra, and sometimes 2 times is good enough for the look that I'm going for. So I do it 3 times here. It's not 100% coverage. There's still some lighter areas and some darker areas, but I like the way that that is looking, and my focus is going to be on the polar bear die cuts anyways. So I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of attention on that background. I always emboss with a piece of cardstock that's larger than I need it to be. So it was 5 1/4, or 5.5 by 4 1/4. I trimmed it down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And then I have a piece of poppy cardstock that I trimmed down, or sorry, not poppy, cranberry cardstock that I trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I'm working on an A2 card base, and I'm using that same Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle to glue all of my layers down. So I also took a scrap piece of white cardstock. I trimmed that to 3 3/4 inches because that's the same size as my snowflake background here. And then I just took my shears and I cut a curved line just to create a snow drift, if you will. You could also do just a straight piece of white cardstock for this. I like doing a curved line because I think it looks a little bit more interesting, but if you want just a straight piece of cardstock, that will absolutely work too. It's one of those details that isn't a very major detail, so it's just personal preference. Once I have that snow piece down, I can glue down my bears. My hat wasn't quite dry, as you could see. It fell off of the bear's head, but it's easy enough to glue that back on and glue it so that it sticks to the background of my card as well. So here is that finished card. I do end up pulling it back out and adding a sentiment and then adding a little bit of stickles to the snowdrift, but I'm going to do that after I complete this second card here. And what I just showed there is the antique white treasured cardstock pack. Those treasured cardstock packs have 15 sheets in them. There's 5 different finishes, so there's 3 sheets per finish. There's a glitter, there's a mirror, there's a brushed, there's pearl, and there's matte. So you have different textures of specialty cardstocks that you can choose, and they go a really long way. With this second card here, I'm using the North Pole sentiment, so I am creating the pole for the North Pole. I've also die cut 2 of the snowmen as well as some accessories. And I'm using that glitter cardstock from the antique white pack for my snowman. I used it for the first card for the trim on the Santa hats or on the toques. I use them for that as well. I like the fact that the glitter for this one, even though the base of it is kind of an antique white, there's some silver flecks in it. So for this particular card, the metallic I chose to accent things with was the matte silver from the Silver Treasured Cardstock pack. I have it not only on the striping for the pole, but I also have it on the solid piece to go behind the Let It Snow sign for that pole. For one of my snowmen, I'm doing the kind of cowboy hat-ish. I don't know whether it's called something else. I have that die cut out of some Fern Cardstock. And then the accents for this one, I have die cut out of Wildberry Cardstock. I am not used to doing pink with red when it comes to Christmas stuff, so I went a little bit outside of my comfort zone here, and I have this Wildberry as well as the Cranberry. Cranberry is a little bit darker tone to the red, but I love the look of it. But I just grew up, you don't add or you don't put pink and red together. So it's one of those habits that gets a little bit hard sometimes to, or one of the little rules that gets a little bit hard sometimes to break. Those DIY holiday cards, there was pinks as well as reds in this particular image. So it made it a little bit easier to go against what I grew up with. So as I'm gluing these together, sometimes I'm just gluing the pieces right to them. Sometimes I'm using reverse tweezers to help put those pieces on, especially the tiny ones on the face. The reverse tweezers are nice because you can hold the piece and add the glue without getting glue all over your fingers, as well as without getting your fingers in the way. For the little cheek pieces, I'm trying to use my jewel picker here, but they didn't want to really cooperate with me, so I ended up having to grab some of those pieces with my hands. I also tend to use my die picker or die pick to push those pieces in place just to make sure they're positioned while that glue is drying. So once again, the base of this snowman is that glitter cardstock, so it is going to take a few extra minutes for that to dry. I know at times it is a frustration for people when they use glitter cardstock, thinking that you can't use it because the glue doesn't dry on there. It does. You just have to be a little bit extra patient with it. And also for the glitter cardstock, liquid glue is also your friend. It will go into all those nooks and crannies of that glitter cardstock. Again, you have to wait just a little bit of extra time. It takes a little bit of extra patience, but it does hold securely with liquid glue. So for my hat here, my little toque, I have that die cut out of some Fern Cardstock. I also have the little bauble, the pom-pom at the top, as well as the trim die cut with that with that classic white treasured cardstock, the antique white. So it's the same as the base of the snowman. I could have gone and done some white fur or white velvet cardstock to add a different texture to it. I should have done that for that different texture, but that's okay. So for my background for this particular one, I'm using the Snowfall Shimmer press plate. This is one from a recent collection, so I have it in a recent video. And in that video, I use it several different ways. For this particular use, I'm going to use some hammermill cardstock, and I'm going to heat emboss it with some silver embossing powder. So I use my embossing powder tool on my cardstock, ink the plate up with some Versamark ink, put it through my Platinum 6 machine, and then once I have that image pressed into my cardstock, I'm going to pour on the silver embossing powder and then heat emboss that powder. So anytime I'm heat embossing press plate images, because there's so much fine detail in them, and because that image gets kind of pressed into the paper, I try to use super fine embossing powder when possible. It's not available in every single embossing powder finish, but when it's available, I do try to use it just to get a little bit more detail. So I pour that powder on top of my image, over top of a piece of scrap paper. Anything that doesn't stick to the image gets put right back into the jar, and it's one of the great things about embossing is that there's no waste to it. Everything that doesn't stick to the Versamark ink goes onto that scrap paper, gets put right back into the jar. So a jar of embossing powder goes a really, really long way. I use my embossing tool to melt that powder, and as it's melting, you can see it goes from like a matte granular to a nice shiny glossy silver embossing. Now I'm going to ink blend my background here, and that embossing powder will resist the ink blending. So we'll have those silver snowflakes on top of a blue background because I'm going to use that same Tumble Glass Distress ink. If you wanted, you could use blue cardstock to do the press plate embossing on. However, I love the look of ink blending on my background, so I can make some areas lighter, some areas darker. It just has a little bit more visual appeal, a little bit more interest in my opinion. So I trimmed down my snowflake piece here to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I'm using a large Spellbinders ink blending brush, and I have my piece on my sticky mat just to make sure it's not going to move on me while I'm doing that ink blending. I'm heavier around the edges than I am in the center. Again, I like to make some areas heavier and some areas lighter just to give it a little bit more visual appeal. I didn't do much ink blending on the bottom of that piece because just like the last card, I'm going to put a little bit of a snowdrift on there. So again, I have a piece of scrap cardstock that I have trimmed to 3 3/4 inches because it's the same width as my snowflake piece. I use my shears to cut a curved line. For this one, I'm going to save both pieces of that cut. I'm going to put one, the wider one, towards the back, and then this narrower one, the really thin sliver there, I'm going to put it towards the front. I do this regularly. I don't necessarily do it with this thin of a sliver. Usually I kind of cut it almost in, I want to say about 2/3 ish, so that the front piece is a little bit thicker than this, but I thought it would look interesting with that pole on there behind that front little hill. So once I have that down, I can figure out exactly where I'm going to put my snowman. I had several different sentiments cut for this particular card, but I choose just to use the Let It Snow one. I thought it worked best for the theme of the card. And because I'm doing an A2 card and my snowman kind of cover most of that pole, I figured that any other signs that I put lower weren't going to really be seen anyways, so I might as well not waste them. I do end up taking that sign that I was going to put on here and I put it on my first card. So with that pole in place, I can add those snowmen to the front of the card, put my acrylic block on there to let that dry. I glue the second sign onto my first card. Now, I didn't do a background for this sign, so for this Merry Christmas one, the second one, so it is actually going to be showing through, and we're going to see the snowflakes through that writing. The writing is really, really tiny, so you're not going to see a ton of detail, but you will see a little bit of that blue and the white. So once I have that sign down, I'm using my Stardust stickles just to add a little bit of shimmer to the top of that snowdrift. And then I typically will do a line or two just to kind of make it look like there's a snowdrift in the front. And then I will set that aside to totally dry. And it just adds a little bit of extra sparkle and a little bit of extra texture to that snow at the bottom. So for my third card, I'm going to use the Santa's Elves for the main elf on the front of the card. I've also used the North Pole sentiments for a pole as well as a sentiment on my card. I have that die cut out of some cranberry as well as Fern Cardstock. For the elf, I'm going to do her dress with wild berry cardstock. Just to tie in that pink a little bit. I have some pieces die cut out of the Fern cardstock, and then I have her hair die cut out of Fawn cardstock, some black accents with Raven cardstock, and then I have her face done out of chiffon, so it's a really light color. I just realized that I didn't mention at the beginning which colors I was actually using. I mentioned that I was using the DIY Holiday Expansion deck, but not what the actual colors that I chose or that I pulled from the inspiration from that piece. Now, like I said, I have a couple extra colors that I'm using. Like for my last card with the snowman, I pulled in a little bit of carrot cardstock for those carrot noses. So I'm not only using the 5 colors from that DIY deck. It's a main color inspiration, but every once in a while it needs a couple extra colors. Like for instance, the Raven cardstock, the black cardstock for the accents, they're not on the card, but they just tie in perfectly with the little elf. I wanted them to have black shoes as well as a black belt, some little accents to it. I'm also using a little bit of gold. I have the gold belt buckle, and I have that with Santa as well, that I have some gold pieces as well as black pieces on him. So just because you're using the DIY deck images for color inspiration doesn't mean that you can't pull in a different color or two depending on what you're creating and what's appropriate for that particular image. So just like my bears and my snowman, I kind of pop around or jump around when I'm assembling my little elves. I started with the dress, then I'm going with the face and the hair. And as the pieces are drying under my acrylic block, then I'll go in and add other pieces to different areas. Now, when you die cut the boots, as well as the arms and some other pieces, it die cuts them for 2 different elves. So any of those extra pieces, I just pull to the side, and then when I'm done creating, I just put them in a tiny little Ziploc bag, put it with that die set. So next time I'm using that die set, I may want to use those pieces that I've already die cut. That way I know where to look for them if I want to use that particular die set. They're nice and convenient. I don't have to look in a different storage place. I know exactly where any extra pieces that I may have cut from a previous project will be. It makes it really easy to find, and that way those pieces don't go to waste either. And sometimes you can use a smaller piece of cardstock and only cut the pieces that you need. But sometimes there's really subtle differences and you're not exactly sure which one is the one that's going to work for the piece that you're using. So by die cutting both of them, you know you have both of them ready to go. You can grab whichever one is the most appropriate. This is especially the case when it comes to the Clauses die set. Most of Santa and Mrs. Claus's pieces die cut at the same time. They're joined dies. So when I was die cutting those pieces, I die cut the entire die, and anything that is extra I'll just put in a little Ziploc bag, put it with that die set to use for a future project. So again, with the little nose and the cheeks for this particular set, I just put a little bit of glue there and then used my jewel picker to pick up my piece to put in place. I'm also using that same jewel picker to put on the little trim for the mittens as well as the boots. And those pieces I have die cut out of the antique white glitter cardstock, same as the trim for the polar bear hats as well as the little snowman. So I used a lot of that white glitter cardstock for this. I also could have used it for the snowdrifts at the bottom of some of those cards. Some of them it would have been appropriate, like say for the bears, because the bears were done out of velvet cardstock. Probably wouldn't have done it for the snowmen because I want to make sure that those snowmen popped off more than that little snowdrift, but it is definitely an option. For the backgrounds for these signs here, I just used some Hammermill cardstock scraps as well as mirror gold cardstock pieces. They look really great in those signs because then you get the gold mirror letters behind there. I didn't want all of them to be gold though, so that's why I did one of them with that Hammermill, just to make sure that there's a little bit of different texture. For the background for this card, I'm using the sprinkled confetti press plate. I know it's supposed to be confetti, but to me it almost looks like snow falling. So that's what I'm using for my background for this. I'm going to do the same technique as my snowflake background, except this time I'm going to use white embossing powder rather than the silver embossing powder that I did those snowflakes in. And those snowflakes could have been done with white embossing powder as well. I wanted to do the silver because I just like the look of the silver with the blue. But for this particular one here with the snowflakes in just kind of ball or clump form, if you will, I thought it would look nice with white. Another option would be some holographic glitter embossing powder, but in that case I would use some blue cardstock for the background because that glitter embossing powder has a lot of texture to it. It's going to grab the ink when you're doing the ink blending. So I prefer when I'm doing an embossed background that has ink blending to do embossing powders that have a smooth finish to them, like that white embossing powder or the silver embossing powder. So the same technique is used as the snowflakes. I put some embossing powder tool on my Hammermill cardstock before doing my embossing. I used Versamark ink on that plate, put the clear plate onto the base, put it through my die cutting machine to press that image in place, poured the embossing powder on there on top of a scrap piece of cardstock so that any excess can be put right back into that container. And then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. A little bit harder to see on camera with the white on white, but it definitely is there, and you'll definitely see it as I'm doing my ink blending for my background. So just like my other backgrounds, my embossed piece here I trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. For this particular card, I'm using Fern Cardstock for my mat, and I trimmed that to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I'm using that same tumbled glass. When I do a collection of cards in the same video, I kind of like it when the backgrounds are the same color, if not very similar colors. It just adds a little bit of continuity. Just like the last card, I am heavier around the edges and lighter towards the center. I like the look of the different variation of colors. I think it looks just a little bit more interesting. And I also like when it's darker around the edges because it does frame that color. So I do always make sure to use a damp cloth to clean off my sticky mat when I have used it. That way, when I go to use it again, it doesn't come with some surprises of different ink colors that I had forgotten I'd used. I try to be good about that habit. It does stain the mat when you use inks on it. As you can see, my mat is definitely not pristine. It's been stained and very, very well loved, but the ink comes off. The staining doesn't affect the use of the mat in any way. So I glued down my ink blended snowflake background, and now I'm going to glue on the little pole. For this particular card, I didn't add a snowdrift to the bottom. I wanted to do one that had it without. I really prefer the ones with that piece on the bottom for them to stand on. I think it just kind of grounds it a little bit better. But again, I wanted to show one with it not on there as well, just so you can see the difference. I'm adding the little signs to my pole here. For this one, I did add multiple signs because I only have a single elf to go on the front. It wasn't going to cover as much space as the snowman, so I thought having multiple signs on the little pole worked well for this one. So I glued down my elf, and you can see that by having the elf assembled ahead of time, as well as my snowman and my polar bears, I can make it makes it easier when assembling the card itself, because I can put it exactly where I want it. I know that it's going to work there, rather than trying to assemble it on the card and then halfway through deciding that that placement isn't quite right. That's one of the main reasons I put my pieces together ahead of time. So for my Santa, I have him die cut out of some velvet cardstock. Once again, I put it onto a scrap piece of cardstock before die cutting it. The black accents, I'm using the Onyx Treasured Cardstock pack, and I'm using the mirror one. It's a nice glossy black cardstock. So I'm using that for his belt, for his boots. For the gloves, I have just plain black cardstock. And then for the little list that he's going to hold, I have that die cut out of some Fern Cardstock. So most of Santa here is actually that velvet, that dark red velvet, as well as black, just a few other accents. His face is done with that chiffon cardstock, and for his beard and mustache, as well as the trim on his hat, that is done with that antique white glitter cardstock. So there's a lot of texture in him. That's one of the reasons why I opted to only do Santa for this card and not do Santa and Mrs. Claus, because there's kind of a lot going on with the different textures, as well as the fact that Santa from this set was my favorite. I loved having the option of doing Mrs. Claus as well, and I think those would be great for adding to scrapbook pages. For an A2 card, it might be a little bit tight to have both of them on the A2 card. I think I would do a little bit larger card size if you wanted both of them on there. The other texture that I have on here is I have Santa's glasses as well as his belt buckle die cut out of some mirror gold cardstock. So that adds a nice metallic touch as well. Just like my other pieces, I kind of move around or jump around to different areas while I'm assembling, because I'm working on the velvet cardstock as the base. It does take a few extra minutes for those pieces to dry, so you do have to be patient with them. But you can also see that they do come together fairly quickly. The hardest part, in my opinion, of doing Christmas cards with die sets that have a lot of pieces to them is the pre-planning, the pre-die cutting. But like I said at the beginning of the video, I will organize the dies from the set that I'm going to be using by the color or by the cardstock that I'm going to be using, and just take it one step at a time. And then by having everything die cut ready to go, it makes the assembly process so much easier. And you could easily do like mass assembly and do a bunch of these at once if you're going to do, say, 10 of the same card. It would be easy enough to do all of that die cutting at once while you've got it pre-planned to do all of those pieces, have them ready to go, and then just do kind of assembly session where you're assembling the same piece multiple times, and then you would have the Santa element in this case ready to go to create several cards. By doing that assembly line thing, it does streamline the process. It would take a lot longer to do, say, 10 of this card individually, where you're doing all that individual die cutting, then assembly, and then doing more die cutting, then assembly. Much easier to do all the die cutting at once, then all of the assembly of the die cut elements at once, and then assembly of your cards all at once. So that's a great way if you wanted to do multiples of the same die set to do it. I would say personally, if I was going to do multiples of the same set, I would do them over several different nights. I would do, say, the die cutting one night, the assembly of the die cut elements the next night, and then maybe the assembly of the cards the next night, so that it wasn't kind of all at once, or, you know, do a whole day of it or whatnot. I wouldn't do individual cards that way. I would do multiples. I also tend to, if I'm doing multiples of the same card, tend to choose a little bit easier die sets just to make the process a little bit more enjoyable. But it really just depends. Doing, say, putting a movie on, and then just kind of assembling a bunch of die cuts. I tend to do things while I'm watching a movie or watching TV anyways, I'm multitasking. So by having a movie on, it kind of takes the focus away from, say, the monotony of die cut assembly or die cutting in general. because you have a little bit of distraction. And personally, I like the die cutting process as well as the assembly process when I'm not in a time crunch. So here is the Santa. I'm going to put him aside so that he can dry just a little bit more because he has a bunch of that velvet cardstock as well as the glitter cardstock. I do want to give him a little bit of extra time to dry. For this particular card, I'm just using the Argyle Plaid embossing folder. I'm not doing any inking. I wanted to keep it very, very simple. I wanted to have some texture in that background, but I didn't want to take the focus away from the Santa. For this card as well, I have some black cardstock that I'm using as the mat, and I'm also going to use black cardstock for the top part of the flag for the sentiment for this one. I tend not to do a lot of black accents when I'm doing Christmas cards or Santa cards, which is one of the reasons why I did it with this one, because I wanted something just a little bit different than what I normally tend to do. But it is a little bit darker than, say, had I used some Cranberry Cardstock. If you wanted a little bit brighter, I would change the matte on this as well as the upper layer of the sentiment set to that cranberry color, or even you could even do the Fern Cardstock for some green accents just to add a different color to it. It just depends on your personal preference and what you like. And then obviously you can change the colors up. I could have done him in, or Santa in Wild Berry for something completely different or a little bit different. But I wanted him in that velvet cardstock. I just love the look of the Santa with that red velvet suit. So with the solid flag for this sentiment, I did that mirror gold cardstock, so it's going to tie in with his glasses. I realized when I assembled the Santa that the buckle itself got completely covered, so you don't actually see that part. I could have adjusted his hands so they were kind of outside of his body, but with what he was holding, I thought that position worked a little bit better. But because the letters for Merry Christmas there are in gold, they shine nicely in the light and they tie in with his glasses. Then we have our elf card with that snowfall background, and I love the way the letters on the signs that have the mirror gold in the background really show off and really catch the light when you tilt the card into the light. Let It Snow, because it was a matte silver cardstock in that background of that sign, it doesn't sparkle in the light quite as much, but it does tie in nicely with the rest of the silver accents. And then we have the polar bears with that textured velvet for their fur. I absolutely love that texture to it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.